This was a horrible place. There's no recreation here during the work week. There was no nothing.
Alcatraz, 12 acres of solid rock, the nation's toughest federal penitentiary. It's been described in 4 words: maximum security, minimum privileges.
Picture a man sitting in total darkness. No sound, no light. The walls are so close he can touch both of them without straightening his arms. He has been here for 11 days. He was one of the most feared men in America. He ran a criminal empire that made politicians nervous and judges careful. And right now, in this cell, on this island, in this cold and absolute silence, he is weeping. Not because of the darkness, not because of the pain, but because for the first time in his adult life, nobody on earth knows where he is. Nobody is coming for him, and he has finally understood something that no prison before this one ever managed to teach him: that he is nobody. There is a list. It existed in every federal prison in America during the 1930s and 1940s. Wardens kept it quietly. Inmates feared it openly. It was not a list of the most violent prisoners, or the most dangerous, or the most escape-prone. It was simply a list of names. Men who had become too powerful to punish, too connected to control, and too comfortable behind bars to be meaningfully threatened by anything the American justice system could throw at them. And when the government finally decided it had had enough, it did not build a harder prison. It built a different kind of one entirely. It built one on a rock in the middle of a freezing bay, surrounded by water so cold and currents so violent that the island itself became the punishment. This is why Alcatraz was feared, not because of what it did to your body, but because of what it did to everything else. In its characteristically ambitious fashion, decided to solve in a very dramatic way. By the late 1920s, the United States prison system was, to put it generously, not working. Not in the sense that prisons had stopped functioning as physical buildings. The walls were still standing. The cells were still locked. The guards were still getting paid. But the idea behind a prison, which is to say, the notion that a man placed inside one would be removed from society, isolated from his criminal network, stripped of his power, and rendered unable to do further harm, that idea had quietly collapsed. And the men responsible for its collapse were not the average burglar or the desperate small-time thief. They were organized. They were funded. And increasingly, they were more comfortable in prison than most Americans were in their own homes. Prohibition had done something remarkable to American crime. It had professionalized it. Men like Al Capone had built organizations that rivaled legitimate businesses in their complexity, their reach, and their revenue. Capone alone was estimated to be pulling in $60 million a year at the height of his operations. That is roughly $1 billion in today's money, flowing through gambling dens, speakeasies, and protection rackets. And when men like Capone went to prison, as they occasionally did, they did not stop being who they were. They simply relocated their headquarters. The ordinary federal penitentiary of the early 1930s was, for a well-connected mob boss, less of a punishment and more of an inconvenience with good networking opportunities. Powerful inmates received better food. They received better cells. They received visitors who were not exactly blood relatives and had conversations that were not exactly family updates. Guards were bribed. Other inmates were intimidated into silence or loyalty. Entire hierarchies of power existed inside prison walls that mirrored, and in some cases directly served, the hierarchies outside them. A man who went in as a crime boss came out as a crime boss, a little thinner perhaps, but no less dangerous, and often considerably more respected because he had done his time without breaking. This was the problem. And to understand why Alcatraz was the answer, you have to understand something about the psychology of power. A powerful man can survive almost anything as long as he remains powerful. He can survive violence because he has men who protect him. He can survive boredom because he has things to organize and people to command. He can survive imprisonment because imprisonment, in the traditional sense, does not reach the things that actually define him: his reputation, his network, his status among men who fear him. Leave those intact, and you have not really imprisoned him at all. You have merely changed his address. So the federal government, under President Franklin Roosevelt and his Attorney General Homer Cummings, decided to try something that had never quite been attempted at this scale before. Not to simply lock the most dangerous and influential federal criminals away, but to systematically dismantle the very infrastructure of their power. And to do that, they needed a place that was, by its very geography, impossible to run from, and, by its very design, impossible to run. They found their location on a 12-acre island in San Francisco Bay that the Spanish had originally called La Isla de los Alcatrazes, the Island of the Pelicans, which is either a poetic name for one of America's most feared places, or proof that naming things is harder than it looks. The island had already been used as a military fortification and then a military prison. The Army had been locking troublesome soldiers there since the Civil War. By the time the federal government took it over in 1934, the bones of a serious institution were already in place. The government did not have to build Alcatraz from nothing. It had to transform it. And it did, with remarkable speed, and with a very specific philosophy driving every single decision. That philosophy can be summarized in one sentence: you have no power here. Not because we will hurt you if you try to use it, though that was certainly on the table, but because the conditions of this place are specifically engineered to make power meaningless. You cannot bribe a guard who lives on the island and has nowhere to spend money. You cannot run a criminal organization from a cell where your mail is read, your visits are monitored and limited to blood relatives, and your only confirmed communication with the outside world is a conversation conducted through a glass window for 90 minutes, once a month, with a correctional officer listening to every word. You cannot maintain a network when your network does not know where you are. You cannot project strength when the men around you are in exactly the same position and equally desperate. And you cannot maintain the psychological armor of a powerful man when the environment is specifically, relentlessly, and systematically designed to remind you that you are none of those things. That was Alcatraz. Not the most violent prison in America, not the most brutal in the traditional sense, but the most deliberately psychological. A machine not for punishing bodies, though it did plenty of that, but for dissolving identities, for taking men who had spent their entire adult lives building a particular version of themselves, an untouchable version, a feared and respected version, and slowly, methodically, grinding that version down to nothing. And of all the men who passed through its gates between 1934 and 1963, perhaps none arrived with more to lose than the men who came from organized crime. The men who had built empires on fear and loyalty and the kind of reputation that preceded them into every room they entered. Because Alcatraz, as they were about to discover, had a very specific talent. It did not simply take away your freedom. It took away everything that made freedom feel worth having in the first place. To understand why Alcatraz broke men who had survived everything else, you first have to understand what prison actually meant to a mafia soldier or a crime boss before Alcatraz existed. Because for a certain class of criminal in 1930s, America, prison was not the end of the story. It was more like a chapter break. The federal and state penitentiaries of that era operated on a social ecosystem that closely mirrored the world outside. Men with money had comfort. Men with connections had protection. Men with reputations had respect. And in a world where reputation was the only currency that mattered, walking into prison as a known and feared figure was not a humiliation. It was, in a deeply twisted way, something close to a victory lap. Consider what a well-connected mob figure could expect in a standard federal institution. He arrived with a name that other inmates already knew. That name alone bought him something priceless inside any closed environment. It bought him distance. Other prisoners did not pick fights with men whose associates were still operating freely outside. Guards understood, sometimes explicitly, and sometimes through the quiet logic of self-preservation, that certain inmates were not to be casually mistreated. Wardens received letters from lawyers. Lawyers received instructions from men who never appeared in any paperwork. The invisible hand of organized crime reached through prison walls with remarkable ease when those walls existed in a city. Connected to roads. Connected to people. Connected to money. Inside, the hierarchy organized itself quickly. Mafia men clustered with their own. They maintained codes of conduct, systems of loyalty, and informal courts of justice that operated alongside the official rules and frequently superseded them. A boss could issue orders from his cell that would be carried out on the outside before the week was out. A soldier could receive messages through visitors, through carefully worded letters, through guards who had been quietly persuaded that cooperation was in their financial interest. The prison itself, in this context, became almost irrelevant as a punishment. Yes, the man was technically incarcerated. Yes, he was behind walls and under guard. But his power was intact. His identity was intact. His network was intact. And his sentence, whatever its length, was understood by everyone, including him, as a temporary inconvenience, rather than a fundamental reckoning. This was not unique to Italian-American organized crime either. It applied to any sufficiently organized criminal enterprise. Gangs maintained territory from inside. Bootleggers directed operations from their cells. Men who had built their lives on the principle that rules applied to other people found that prison, in most of its incarnations, was simply another environment where that principle held true. The federal government understood this by the early 1930s and found it absolutely maddening, because the entire moral architecture of law enforcement rests on the idea that consequences are real, that punishment is meaningful, and that the state has the final say in who has power and who does not. When a crime boss sits in a federal prison and continues to function as a crime boss, that architecture collapses. The sentence becomes theater. The trial becomes theater. The whole exhausting apparatus of law becomes theater. And the criminal gets to sit in the audience and applaud. So when the Bureau of Prisons began designing what Alcatraz would actually be, they were not simply building a tougher cage. They were engineering a total environment specifically calibrated to destroy the conditions that made power possible. Every single rule, every restriction, every architectural choice, every procedural decision was aimed at the same target. Not the man's body, not even his freedom in the simple physical sense, but the invisible infrastructure of who he was, what he meant to other people, and what he believed about himself. Take away the network, and you take away the influence. Take away the influence, and you take away the reputation. Take away the reputation, and you take away the identity. And take away the identity of a man who has spent 30 years building it, and you have done something that no bullet, no rival, no courtroom ever managed. You have made him irrelevant. In the world these men came from, irrelevance was a fate considerably worse than death. They came by boat. There was no other way. That was the first message, and it was delivered before a single word was spoken. You are on water. You are moving away from everything. The city is behind you and getting smaller, and the island ahead of you is getting larger, and there is nothing in between except cold gray water and the wind coming off the Pacific. Whatever you were before, you stepped onto this boat. Whatever name you carried, and whatever fear that name produced in other men, none of it exists out here. Out here there is only the water and the island, and the fact that you are going to it. Former inmates described the crossing in terms that had nothing to do with distance. The actual trip from the mainland was short, a matter of minutes, but those minutes carried a particular weight that longer journeys rarely produce, because everyone on that boat knew exactly where they were going and exactly what it meant. Men who had been through the intake process of multiple prisons, men who were not easily rattled, men who had been shot at and stabbed at and had survived things that would dismantle most people entirely. Those men went quiet on that crossing in a way they could not always explain afterward. The island approached, and the first thing that struck most arrivals was not the prison building itself, but the water around it. Dark, fast, cold, Even in summer, the bay around Alcatraz ran at temperatures that could kill an unprepared swimmer within 15 to 20 minutes. The currents were not just strong, but unpredictable, shifting in directions that defeated calculation. The city of San Francisco sat roughly a mile and a quarter away across that water, close enough to see the lights at night, close enough on a clear day to make out individual buildings, and absolutely, definitively, murderously unreachable. Then the island itself. The cell house sitting high on the rock, white and austere, surrounded by a series of walls and fences and towers that made its purpose immediately clear. Not a reformatory, not a rehabilitation facility, a containment structure, built to hold things in with the same focused engineering that a dam is built to hold water. They were marched off the boat and processed with a speed and impersonality that several former inmates recalled as one of the more quietly disturbing aspects of arrival. There was no orientation speech. There was no explanation of how things worked or what was expected. There was simply procedure. Strip, shower, examination, uniform, number. The uniform deserves a moment because the uniform was not incidental. In the world most of these men came from, clothing was identity. The cut of a suit, the quality of a tie, the particular way a hat sat on a head, these things communicated status in a language that required no words. They were signals. Alcatraz removed all signals simultaneously and replaced them with a single undifferentiated uniform that every man wore, from the lowest first-time offender to the most decorated crime boss in federal custody. The uniform said nothing about who you were. That was the point. The number was worse. Each inmate received a number that replaced, in all official contexts, the name they had carried their entire life. A name is a story. A name is a history. A name is the thing other men say when they speak about you, when they fear you, when they respect you. A number is an administrative convenience. The transition from one to the other was, for many arrivals, the first moment that the true nature of Alcatraz became real in a way that the boat crossing and the water and the walls had not quite managed to communicate. You were not a man with a history here. You were a unit in a count, and you were going to be counted 13 times a day, every single day, for as long as the government decided you needed to be here. Then the silence. Because in the early years especially, under the first warden James Johnston, Alcatraz operated under a rule of silence that would have impressed a medieval monastery. Prisoners were not permitted to speak in the cell blocks, not permitted to speak while being processed, not permitted to speak while being assigned their cells. They moved through the intake procedure in a quiet, so total and so deliberately maintained that several men described it as the first genuinely frightening thing they experienced. Not the walls, not the guards, the silence. Because silence meant that no one was going to explain anything to you. You were going to figure it out, or you were going to suffer the consequences of not figuring it out. And either way, the institution had nothing more to say on the subject. They were walked to their cells. 5 feet wide, 9 feet deep, a cot, a toilet with no seat, 1 tap, cold water only, a shelf, a small window that let in light but offered no view of anything that could be described as hopeful. The door closed, and for the first time, many of these men understood something about the word alone that they had never previously had occasion to learn. Alphonse Gabriel Capone arrived at Alcatraz on August 22, 1934. He was 35 years old. He had, at the peak of his operation, commanded an organization of roughly 600 men. He had controlled judges, politicians, police captains, and city officials across Chicago and beyond. He had survived assassination attempts, federal investigations, and the sustained attention of the most famous law enforcement agent in American history. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most powerful private citizens in the United States. He lasted approximately 72 hours before the other inmates tried to kill him. This is not a metaphor. In one of his first days on the island, a fellow prisoner named James Lucas approached Capone in the shower room with a pair of scissors and stabbed him. Capone survived, but the incident communicated something important about his new circumstances that no amount of official intake procedure could have conveyed quite as efficiently. He was not powerful here. The thing about Capone's reputation, the thing that had kept him safe and feared and untouchable for most of his adult life, was that it operated through networks. The men who feared him feared the organization behind him. They feared the consequences that came with crossing a man connected to hundreds of other men. Men who had demonstrated on multiple documented occasions that they were both willing and able to visit extreme violence on those who caused problems. Remove the network, and the fear evaporates. On Alcatraz, there was no network. There were only men in identical uniforms, with identical numbers, who had all arrived with their own reputations and their own reasons to establish dominance, and absolutely nothing to lose by taking a run at the most famous criminal in America. Capone's attempts to adapt were almost poignant in retrospect. He tried, in the early period of his sentence, to do what he had always done, which was to organize. He tried to establish informal hierarchies. He tried to use money and the promise of outside connections to buy loyalty and protection. He tried to leverage his name, and the administration, which had been built specifically to prevent all of these things, closed off each avenue with a patience and thoroughness that Capone seemed genuinely unable to comprehend. This was a man who had bent every environment he had ever entered to his will. The idea of an environment that simply could not be bent was not something his operating system had previously encountered. His privileges were exactly what every other inmate's privileges were. He ate the same food, wore the same uniform, slept in the same size cell, and was counted the same 13 times per day. When he requested special treatment, which he did, the requests were denied with the same bureaucratic disinterest that they would have been denied had they come from any other prisoner number. The warden James Johnston was, by all accounts, genuinely impervious to the Capone mystique. He had been briefed on exactly this contingency, and his response to it was essentially to pretend that Capone was no one in particular, which turned out to be the most psychologically devastating thing anyone had ever done to him. The music helped for a while. Capone joined the prison band, the Rock Islanders, and by multiple accounts, genuinely threw himself into it, learning the tenor banjo, the guitar, eventually more than 500 songs. He practiced with something approaching devotion, which made complete sense when you understood the context. Music was one of the few activities in Alcatraz where a man's individual effort produced an individual result, where being good at something meant something, where you could briefly experience the sensation of being distinguished from the identical mass of men around you. For a man who had spent his entire life being distinguished, the prison band was not a hobby. It was a lifeline. But it was not enough. It was never going to be enough, because the deeper problem was not boredom. The deeper problem was syphilis, which Capone had contracted years earlier, and which, in the 1930s without effective treatment, was working its way through his central nervous system with no particular hurry, but considerable determination. By the midpoint of his sentence, his mental state had begun to deteriorate noticeably. He became confused. He became paranoid in ways that went beyond the reasonable paranoia of a man who had already been stabbed. He developed what fellow inmates and guards described as an increasingly childlike quality, a disconnection from the present moment that grew worse over time. The man who had once kept track of the financial flows of a $60 million criminal empire could not always remember where he was or why. He was released in 1939, having served 7.5 years, and died in 1947 at his Florida estate. He was 48 years old. The most powerful gangster in American history had been broken not by a rival, not by a bullet, not by the electric chair that many people had expected would eventually be his destination. He had been broken by a tiny cell, a system designed to render him irrelevant, and a disease that the isolation of Alcatraz gave him nothing to fight with. In every prison he had inhabited before the Rock, Al Capone had been Al Capone. At Alcatraz, he was number 85, and in the end, it turned out that the number was more accurate than the name. Alcatraz did not break men through dramatic cruelty. That is the popular assumption, and it is mostly wrong. There were no medieval torture devices. There were no systematic beatings administered by sadistic guards following official policy. The physical conditions, while unpleasant, were in several respects better than other federal institutions of the era. The food was genuinely good, a deliberate choice by the administration on the sensible grounds that hungry men make trouble and well-fed men are somewhat more manageable. The medical care was adequate. The cells were small, but not uniquely squalid. The instrument Alcatraz used was not pain, it was control. Total, granular, relentless, suffocating control over every dimension of a man's existence, exercised not in dramatic moments of confrontation, but in the steady, grinding, invisible pressure of absolute routine. The day began at 6:30 in the morning when the lights came on and the count began. The first of 13 counts that would occur between waking and sleeping. 13 times per day, every day, an inmate stood at his cell door or against a wall and was counted. Not because the administration genuinely feared that men were vanishing between breakfast and lunch, but because being counted 13 times a day communicates something to a man in a way that no speech could. It says, "We know exactly where you are at all times. You are accounted for. You are a number in a tally. And we will confirm that you are a number in that tally 13 times today and every subsequent day until further notice." After the morning count came breakfast, which inmates ate in silence, in order, marching to the dining hall in a procession that had been timed and organized to the minute. Then work, which was compulsory and assigned, not chosen, not negotiated. Assigned. A man might work in the laundry, processing the military's clothing contracts, spending his days in hot, damp rooms, feeding cloth through machines. He might work in the kitchen. He might work on the dock. He earned between 5 and 12 cents an hour for this labor, which was not enough to purchase anything meaningful and was not intended to be. The work was not economic. It was structural. It filled hours. It removed the dangerous space that unoccupied time creates in the mind of a confined man. The rule of silence, enforced rigorously under the first warden and maintained in softer form afterward, removed the last tool that men in confinement traditionally use to maintain their sense of self. Talk. In prison, as in all human environments, identity is partly performed and partly confirmed through conversation. You tell stories about yourself. Other men respond to those stories. You argue, joke, persuade, threaten. All of these are acts of selfhood, tiny daily confirmations that you exist as a particular person and not merely as a body occupying a given volume of space. Alcatraz removed this so thoroughly that inmates took to communicating through the pipes between cells in whispered conversations that resembled nothing so much as two men speaking to each other through the walls of adjacent tombs. The privileges system compounded all of this, because unlike a system of pure deprivation, which produces a predictable kind of suffering that men can steel themselves against, Alcatraz operated on a system of conditional reward that kept men in a constant state of behavioral calculation. The library access could be given or taken. The radio headsets could be given or taken. The visitation rights, so carefully limited to begin with, could be suspended. Work assignments that made the hours pass could be revoked. Even the band, that fragile lifeline, required a standard of good behavior that could be revoked at administrative discretion. What this produced was not a population of men openly rebelling against their conditions, but a population of men quietly, exhaustingly managing them. Always aware, always calculating, always just slightly uncertain whether today's behavior had earned tomorrow's small comfort or foreclosed it. This is the kind of tension that does not express itself in dramatic breakdowns. It accumulates, quietly, over months and years, in a way that leaves no obvious mark until suddenly the marks are everywhere and the man in the cell is not quite the man who arrived. If the regular routine of Alcatraz was a slow erosion, the punishment block was something more immediate. Something that former inmates, men who were not in the habit of admitting fear, described with a consistency and a particular quality of recalled dread that is hard to dismiss as exaggeration. Cellblock D, known among inmates simply as the hole, was where the institution's velvet gloves came off. The cells there were larger than the standard cells, which sounds like an improvement until you understand the context. The additional space was not a comfort. It was an amplification chamber, more room for the silence, more walls to be alone with. Inmates sent to the hole were there for 24 hours a day, with one exception per week, a brief period in the small exercise yard that only underscored how complete the confinement was for the remaining 167 hours. They received no library access, no work assignment, no radio, no contact with other inmates beyond the muffled and distant sounds of the institution going about its day above and around them. The deepest punishment within the punishment block was the strip cell. These were cells stripped of everything: the cot, the wash basin, the toilet seat, everything except 4 walls, a floor, a ceiling, and a hole in the floor for waste. The lights could be controlled from outside. Guards could plunge the cell into total darkness or illuminate it at will, removing even the natural rhythm of day and night that humans rely on more deeply than most of us realize until it is gone. Meals were bread and water. The temperature, shaped by the island's perpetual wind and the concrete's complete indifference to human comfort, was cold in a way that was not dramatic, but was relentless. The kind of cold that does not produce suffering in any single moment, but that works into the joints and the mind over days, and becomes by the end of a week a presence as real and consistent as a companion. Former inmate Jim Quillen spent 19 days in the hole and described it as 19 days of total silence and darkness, during which time appeared to behave differently from the way it behaved outside. Not faster or slower exactly, but structureless. Without the regular markers of light and meal and count and work that organized existence in the main cell blocks, time in the hole became a formless medium that a man moved through without any reliable way of knowing where in it he was. Quillen said that a day in the hole felt like an eternity, which is the kind of thing that sounds like hyperbole until you consider that the statement comes from a man who had been incarcerated in multiple facilities and was therefore in a better position than most to calibrate his eternities. The psychological mechanism at work in the hole was not complicated. Human beings require certain basic inputs to maintain a stable sense of self and time and reality. Light, sound, social contact, routine, physical movement. Remove enough of them for long enough, and the mind begins to do things that are difficult to describe as anything other than breaking. Hallucinations, paranoia, a dissolution of the boundary between memory and present experience. The medical literature on prolonged isolation is extensive and unanimous in its conclusions. It is among the most effective forms of psychological damage that can be inflicted on a human being, and it requires no violence at all. The men who ran Alcatraz knew this. They may not have described it in those terms, but they knew that the hole worked, and they used it accordingly. There is a temptation, when discussing Alcatraz, to focus on the institutional cruelty and overlook the human cruelty that operated alongside it. But the fear inside the rock was not only the fear of the administration and its rules and its punishments, it was also the fear of the men in the cells around you. Alcatraz held, at its operational peak, around 260 to 300 inmates. These were not average federal prisoners. By design, by policy, by the explicit intention of the Bureau of Prisons, Alcatraz received the men who had proven themselves too dangerous, too disruptive, or too difficult to manage in every other institution that had tried. This was a concentration of violence and instability that had no real parallel in the American system. Men who had stabbed guards at other prisons, men who had organized riots, men who had escaped and been recaptured and escaped again, men who had spent years in various forms of institutional confinement and had metabolized that experience in ways that made them profoundly and permanently dangerous. And now they were all in one place, with nothing to do except be confined together. The explosion that everyone feared came in May of 1946 and lasted 2 days. 6 inmates, including a man named Bernard Coy, managed to obtain weapons after Coy, remarkably, squeezed his body through a set of bar spreaders he had fashioned from plumbing fixtures over weeks of patient work. The group freed additional inmates, seized a gun gallery, and for a brief period controlled a significant section of the prison. The plan, such as it was, fell apart when a set of keys that should have opened the recreation yard door did not, a detail that the planning had somehow overlooked, and what had begun as an escape attempt collapsed into a desperate and cornered violence. The Army and Marines were eventually called in to assist. When the Battle of Alcatraz ended, 2 guards were dead, 3 inmates were dead, and a significant portion of the cell block had been shredded by grenades. Day to day, violence was less cinematic, but no less real. The combination of extreme confinement, mandatory proximity to genuinely dangerous men, and a silence rule that removed the social release valve of conversation created pressure that had to go somewhere. Stabbings occurred with implements fashioned from spoons, from wire, from anything that could be worked to a point. Arguments that could not be verbally resolved because verbal resolution required conversation, and conversation was restricted, had a tendency to resolve physically instead. A man could be in genuine danger from a neighbor he had never been permitted to speak to, over an offense he might not be entirely certain he had committed, in a dispute that had no mechanism for de-escalation, because the system had removed all the mechanisms. The guards occupied a strange position in this environment. They were the instrument of the institution's authority, but they were also, at the end of their shift, men who had to walk through a facility full of people who had nothing to lose, and who in some cases had demonstrated a willingness to kill. The relationship between guards and inmates at Alcatraz was not uniformly brutal. There were guards who were remembered by former inmates with something approaching respect, or even warmth. But there were also guards who operated in the way that people sometimes do when they have total authority over people who have no recourse. The administration's official position was that corporal punishment was not permitted. The unofficial reality was somewhat more variable. What this produced was an environment where no one, inmate or guard, was fully relaxed. Ever. Where the potential for violence was a constant atmospheric condition rather than an occasional event. Where the question was never whether something was going to happen, but when, and to whom, and how bad. Living in that kind of sustained alertness for years does things to the human nervous system that do not simply reverse when the sentence ends. Men left Alcatraz different from how they entered it. Not just older, different. The cold is the first thing you need to understand about the water surrounding Alcatraz. Not cold in the way that a swimming pool in October is cold, unpleasant but manageable. Cold in the medical sense. The bay around the island ran at an average temperature of between 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, which sounds survivable until you understand what that temperature does to a human body that is immersed in it without protection. In water at 50 degrees, the average person loses meaningful muscular coordination within 30 minutes. Within an hour, in most cases considerably less, unconsciousness follows. The 1.25 miles between Alcatraz and the San Francisco waterfront is not a recreational swim under those conditions. It is a death sentence that takes between 20 and 45 minutes to execute, depending on the swimmer's physical condition, their mental state, and the behavior of the currents on that particular day. The currents are the second thing you need to understand. The bay around Alcatraz does not behave like open water. It is a complex tidal system where the outflow of San Francisco Bay meets the inflow of the Pacific through the Golden Gate, creating currents that shift in direction and intensity in ways that are difficult to predict from the water's surface, and were essentially impossible to predict from inside a prison cell. A swimmer who entered the water on the south side of the island might be pulled west toward the ocean. One who entered on the north side might be swept east toward the East Bay. Men who survived drowning could be carried miles from shore before conditions changed, with a city they could see clearly from their cell window, becoming, in the water, completely unreachable. Then there were the sharks. The shark stories were, in large part, myth. Great white sharks do pass through San Francisco Bay, but encounters with swimmers were rare enough to be noteworthy rather than routine. However, the myth was carefully maintained and enthusiastically circulated among the inmate population, because a myth about sharks does exactly the same psychological work as actual sharks while requiring considerably less maintenance. 14 escape attempts involved 36 prisoners over the prison's 29-year history. Of those, 23 were recaptured. 6 were shot and killed during their attempts. 2 drowned with their bodies recovered. 5 were listed as missing and presumed drowned, their bodies never found. And 3, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers John and Clarence, vanished in June of 1962 and were never definitively accounted for in either direction. Morris was, by any measure, one of the more intelligent people to pass through Alcatraz. His IQ had been tested at 133. He had been escaping from institutions since adolescence, a kind of career criminal autodidact who applied genuine intellectual rigor to the problem of getting out of places that wanted him to stay in. His method at Alcatraz involved months of patient work, enlarging the ventilation holes in his cell using a spoon sharpened against the cell floor, constructing papier-mâché dummy heads to prop in his bed for the nightly counts, and fashioning a raft and life preservers from more than 50 raincoats acquired piece by piece over the course of a year. He and the Anglin brothers reached the water. What happened after that has been the subject of 60 years of speculation, investigation, and at least one major film. The FBI officially concluded they drowned. A 2011 hydraulic study suggested that if they entered the water during the window, Morris had calculated the current would have been favorable enough to carry them to the Marin headlands north of the city. Several letters purportedly from John Anglin have surfaced over the decades, all unverified. The mystery has never been conclusively resolved. What is known is that of the 36 men who attempted escape, 33 either died, failed, or could not be determined to have succeeded. The psychological effect of this record on the remaining inmates was not incidental. It was, in a sense, the most effective security measure the island had. Not the walls, not the counts, not the guards. The water, and the knowledge of what the water had done to the men who had tried it. In most prisons, the possibility of escape is a flame that keeps hope alive, regardless of how unrealistic the possibility is. At Alcatraz, that flame had been very methodically put out. Time in confinement does not pass the way time passes outside. This is not a poetic observation. It is a neurological one. The human brain constructs its sense of time's passage from variety, from the accumulation of new experiences that can be distinguished from previous ones and arranged into a narrative of change. Take away variety, and you take away the material from which time is constructed. What remains is not the pleasant sensation of stillness. It is something much stranger and considerably more distressing. At Alcatraz, the routine was identical every day. The same count at the same times. The same march to the same dining hall for the same meals prepared by the same kitchen staff. The same cell. The same small window. The same sounds. Former inmates who served long sentences described a phenomenon that psychologists would later study extensively in long-term isolation contexts. The years do not accumulate in memory the way years outside do. They blur. They flatten. The distance between year 1 and year 5 feels shorter than the distance between any 2 weeks of ordinary life, because ordinary life produces distinguishable memories, and Alcatraz, in its radical monotony, produced almost none. This is a form of theft. A man who enters Alcatraz at 35 and leaves at 45 has not simply lost 10 years of freedom. He has lost 10 years of self. Because selfhood is constructed from experience, from change, from the sense that you are moving through time, and time is moving through you, and Alcatraz specifically and deliberately removed all of that. The man who left was older, but in many ways he was less formed than the man who arrived, because the years in between had not added to him. They had subtracted. Several inmates who spent extended periods at Alcatraz described the same sequence of psychological stages with enough consistency that it begins to look less like individual response and more like a predictable human reaction to a particular set of conditions. The first stage was adaptation. A man arrives and attempts to establish control over whatever small sphere is available to him. His cell, his routine, the careful management of his behavior to protect whatever privileges he has earned or hopes to earn. The second stage, coming for most men somewhere in the middle period of a long sentence, was what the inmates themselves called going stir, a creeping disorientation that was not dramatic enough to be called madness, but was not compatible with anything resembling psychological health. Increased irritability, difficulty concentrating, a growing inability to imagine a future that extended beyond the walls, which becomes a problem because imagining a future is one of the primary mechanisms through which people endure an intolerable present. The third stage was harder to name because it varied by individual. For some, it was a kind of philosophical resignation, a flattening of affect that former inmates described as the feeling of no longer caring what happened to them, which sounds peaceful until you consider that caring what happens to you is the basic motivational engine of human existence. For others, it was something more acute. The prison's own records showed a rate of mental breakdown, attempted suicide, and diagnosed psychiatric disorder that was, by the administration's own reluctant acknowledgement, significantly higher than the federal prison system average. Brian Conway, an inmate who served time in the 1930s, claimed that the monotony and discipline drove 14 of 317 prisoners violently insane during the final year of his sentence alone. This number is difficult to verify, and Conway was not an unbiased observer, but it is consistent with what we know about the effects of prolonged isolation and radical routine on the human mind, which is that they are not neutral. They produce damage. The damage is not always visible. It does not always manifest in dramatic breakdown. But it is real, and it is cumulative, and at Alcatraz, the conditions for producing it were as carefully engineered as the cells and the counts and the currents in the bay. Long before tourists were paying $60 for the ferry crossing, Alcatraz had developed a reputation inside the criminal world that operated independently of anything the government had officially communicated about it. The federal prison system did not run a marketing campaign for the Rock. It did not need to. The men who went there carried the story back when they left, or they sent it through the informal communication networks that connected prisons across the country in a system of rumor and report that moved faster than official mail. What these accounts communicated was not the physical hardship of Alcatraz, which, as has been noted, was in some respects no worse than other institutions. It was the specific quality of the powerlessness. The way the place removed not just freedom, but influence. The way a man's name, which in the criminal world was his most valuable asset, became in the corridors of Alcatraz a number on a count sheet. The way money could not move through those walls. The way loyalties could not be maintained across that water. The way even the most carefully constructed identity could not survive the relentless administrative insistence that the identity did not matter. This was the thing that resonated through the criminal world in a way that straightforward brutality would not have. Violence was familiar. Men who had built their lives around violence understood it and had made their accommodations with it. But the particular erasure that Alcatraz performed, the systematic dismantling of the social self, that was something new. That was something that reached into the part of a man that prisons were not supposed to be able to reach, and word of it spread accordingly. By the late 1940s, the threat of transfer to Alcatraz was a meaningful disciplinary tool across the federal prison system. Inmates who were causing trouble at other institutions could be brought into line with the suggestion that their file was being reviewed for possible transfer. Not always, not by every warden, but often enough that the possibility carried weight. A man might absorb the prospect of a harsher physical environment with equanimity. The prospect of Alcatraz produced a different kind of response, something quieter, something that went a little deeper than ordinary fear. The legend compounded itself, as legends do. The escape attempts that failed became part of the story. The men who drowned in the attempt became cautionary figures. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers became, paradoxically, the most famous people in the Alcatraz story, not because they succeeded, but because their fate was unknown, which turned out to be a far more haunting narrative than simple failure. The island acquired in the public imagination and in the criminal world simultaneously a quality of the absolute. It was the end of the line, the place where the ordinary rules of the criminal ecosystem did not apply, the place where you went when every other institutional option had been exhausted. And that reputation did the work of 1,000 guards, because a place that men fear in that particular way, not with the fear of pain, but with the fear of becoming nothing, does not need to advertise itself. The fear does the advertising. By the early 1960s, the most feared prison in America was falling apart. Not metaphorically, literally. The salt air and the relentless Pacific moisture were doing to the concrete and steel of Alcatraz what they did to everything on that island eventually, which was to penetrate it, corrode it, and begin the slow process of returning it to the rock it had been built on. The cost of maintaining the facility, of repairing the constant damage, of operating a prison on an island where every single thing from toilet paper to industrial equipment had to be transported by boat, had reached a level that the Bureau of Prisons could no longer justify against the alternatives. The figures were stark. In 1959, it cost $10 per day to house an inmate at Alcatraz. The average for the federal prison system was $3. The plumbing was deteriorating in ways that created health risks. The cellblock structure was showing cracks that were expensive to repair and, given the salt environment, would simply reappear. An estimate commissioned in the early 1960s determined that to bring the facility up to adequate condition would require somewhere in the range of $5 million, which was, for a prison that held fewer than 300 men, an almost comical expenditure. But the financial argument, while real, was not the only one. The American prison reform movement, which had been growing through the 1950s, had begun to articulate a critique of Alcatraz that went beyond the practical. The idea that rehabilitation was possible and that prisons had some obligation to pursue it was gaining institutional ground. Alcatraz, which had been explicitly and unapologetically designed around the opposite philosophy, the philosophy that certain men were beyond rehabilitation and needed only to be contained, and if possible psychologically neutralized, sat uncomfortably against this new framework. There was also the small matter of politics. Alcatraz sat in San Francisco Bay, visible from the city, and the city had opinions about it. The boat that brought tourists past the island also brought past the island the daily reminder that whatever America was doing with its worst citizens, it was doing it in a place that looked like what it was and did not try to pretend otherwise. Attorney General Robert Kennedy ordered a review of the facility in 1962. The review confirmed what the financial reports had already indicated. The conclusion was not that Alcatraz had failed in its mission, but that it had become too expensive a way to pursue it, and that the Bureau of Prisons could achieve comparable results at lower cost in newer, purpose-built facilities on the mainland. On March 21, 1963, the last inmates were transferred off the island. Warden Olin Blackwell oversaw the closure. The last prisoner to leave was Frank Weatherman, who reportedly told reporters as he walked to the boat that Alcatraz was not good for nobody. It was a grammatically imperfect sentence, and also, in its way, an entirely accurate assessment of 29 years of deliberate institutional philosophy. The federal government declared the island surplus property. The Bureau of Indian Affairs briefly occupied it in a protest occupation that lasted 19 months and which would become an important moment in the Native American rights movement. Eventually, the island passed to the National Park Service, which began offering tours, and which is how San Francisco ended up with a $60 tourist attraction built on the bones of America's most feared prison. There is a particular kind of fear that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with the sound of a door slamming, or the sight of a weapon, or the proximity of a man who intends you harm. It arrives quietly. It arrives in the morning count, in the identical view from the same window on the same morning as the morning before and the morning before that. It arrives in the moment when a man reaches for his name and finds a number there instead. It arrives in the recognition, slow and then sudden and then impossible to unknow, that the self you have spent a lifetime building is not permanent. That it is, in fact, quite fragile. That it depends for its existence on certain conditions that can be removed, and that someone has removed them. This was what Alcatraz actually was, underneath the history, and the legend, and the tourist ferries, and the documentary films. It was an experiment in a very specific philosophical question. What happens to a powerful man when you take away not his body, but his power? Not his life, but the meaning he has built around his life. Not his freedom in the simple sense of movement, but his freedom in the deeper sense of being someone rather than something. The answer, played out across 29 years and 1,545 men, was consistent enough to be considered a conclusion. What happens is that the powerful man becomes, in time, a man who was once powerful. And a man who was once powerful, cut off from every confirmation of that former self, surrounded by a system that insists at 13 checkpoints per day that he is a number in a count, immersed in a silence that offers no surface for identity to reflect off, facing water that killed the people who tried to leave. That man does not become stronger. He does not harden into something more formidable. He becomes, in the clinical and precise meaning of the word, less coherent, less certain, less present, less himself. Al Capone arrived at Alcatraz as the most famous criminal in America and left 8 years later as a man with advanced neurological deterioration who was confused about where he was. The bank robbers and the bootleggers and the murderers and the mob soldiers who passed through those cells served their time and emerged into a world that had moved on without them, into criminal networks that had reorganized around their absence, into a freedom that many of them found, by multiple accounts, more frightening than the confinement they had left. Because confinement, at a certain depth and duration, does not merely hold a man in place. It becomes the only place he knows how to be. The physical building has been open to tourists for decades now. You can walk the cell blocks, stand in the cells, look out the windows toward the city. You can take the audio tour, which is very good, and learn the history and the escape attempts and the names of the famous inmates. And it is interesting. It is genuinely, historically interesting. But the real Alcatraz is not the building. It was never the building. The building was just the container. The real Alcatraz was the idea. The idea that you can take a man who believes himself to be beyond the reach of consequences and prove him wrong. Not by killing him, not by breaking his bones, but by the patient and systematic removal of everything he believes himself to be. One rule, and one count, and one silent day at a time, until the man who remains is not quite the man who arrived, and cannot entirely remember that he ever was. That is why it was feared. Not because it killed quickly. Anyone can kill quickly, but because it erased slowly. And there is nothing in the world, not a bullet, not a rival, not a judge or a jury, or a sentence of any length, that frightens a powerful man more than the prospect of becoming irrelevant, of becoming nobody. Alcatraz did not threaten that. Alcatraz delivered it.